Welcome, everybody. My name is Jill Zippin. I am chairwoman of Democratic Jewish Outreach Pennsylvania, the only Jewish Democratic PAC in the state of Pennsylvania. For those of you who are not familiar with DJOP, we work to elect Democratic candidates who best reflect both Jewish and Democratic values. You can learn more about our work and check out our newly revamped website at djop.org. I want to acknowledge Haley Seufer, who I believe is on this Zoom, who is the CEO of Jewish Democratic Council of America, which is the National Jewish Democratic Organization, of which DJOP is an affiliate. We are pleased to present this program to you today. We have amazing speakers. Those speakers are Martin Raffel, Nimrod Novik, Susan Wild, and Steve Sheffy. I'll give a fuller introduction momentarily. I want to let you know if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. That would be greatly appreciated. The first segment of our program will be Martin Raffel questioning Nimrod and Steve questioning Congresswoman Susan Wild. Now for some brief introductions. Congresswoman Susan Wild was elected as the first woman to represent Pennsylvania's 7th Congressional District. She is now in her 3rd term. She serves on the Foreign Affairs Committee, and she's a ranking member of the Subcommittee for Global Health, Human Rights, and International Organizations. She's the only Jewish congressperson to the PA congressional delegation. Nimrod Novik is Israel Policy Forum's Israel Fellow, the former senior advisor on foreign policy to the late Shimon Peres. He's currently a senior associate at the Economic Cooperation Foundation and is a member of the executive committee at the Commanders for Israel Security. He maintains close ties with the Egyptian intelligence community, the Jordanian security establishment, Palestinian political leadership, as well as senior US, European, UN, and other relevant officials dealing with Mideast policy. And he's coming to us today from Israel, where it's around 5 o'clock. Martin Raffel studied law at the Hebrew University and worked for Israel's Ministry of Justice. He was the assistant director of the American Jewish Committee's Philadelphia chapter. And from 1987 until his retirement in 2014, he was senior vice president and lead professional on Israel and international concerns at the Jewish Council for Public Affairs. And DJOP is extremely lucky to have him on our board of directors. Steve Sheffy is the president of Steve Sheffy Consulting, which specializes in public policy, communications, government relations, and legal services for businesses and nonprofits. His weekly pro-Israel political update has thousands of subscribers in the US and Israel and is read by everyone who's anyone in the American and Israeli political community. He's also appeared in the Huffington Post, the Jerusalem Post, and the Times of Israel. If you do not get his newsletter, you are truly missing out, and I encourage you strongly to subscribe. And we are thrilled that he is with us today. So we are going to begin this program with Martin having a conversation with Nimrod, Steve then talking to Congressman Wild, and then we'll open it up. So Martin, why don't you begin?
Okay, thanks, Jill, and thank you to all the participants who are sharing part of their Sunday morning with us, and Nimrod, who's sharing part of his Sunday afternoon with us. So Nimrod, let's lay a foundation, and let's assume that there are people participating in this program who haven't followed the events unfolding in Israel these last several months with the closeness that we have. You know, we have an Israeli prime minister and other officials in his government who have been trying to make the case that their judicial, quote unquote, reform is necessary in order to make Israel more democratic and to rein in an out of control Israeli Supreme Court. Obviously, hundreds of thousands of Israeli citizens have disagreed with that and have taken to the streets in the last several months. Does the plan that has been put forward by Justice Minister Levin pose a severe, clear and present danger to Israel's democracy? And if so, what are the most dangerous aspects of the plan for Israel's democracy?
Well, thank you all for having me. Allow me just a personal note. I'm delighted to be back in Pennsylvania, even though just virtually spent glorious years of my life over there with my wife and our firstborn child who was born there. My wife and I both hold PhDs from the University of Pennsylvania, and the Jewish community of Philadelphia embraced us in ways that we had not anticipated. So it left a lasting mark on us. As to what's going on here, I would say that the bottom line is quite simple. The details are complicated and we'll drop them, but the bottom line is quite simple. Unlike the US, in Israel, we not only do not have a constitution, but in practice, we only have two branches of government. Because of the coalition structure of the government, once a government has a majority in the Knesset, it exists. Once it loses it, it does not. By virtue of having a majority in the Knesset, the executive controls the legislature. The second branch really is the court system, primarily the Supreme Court. What the new so-called reform is trying to do is undo the Supreme Court and the court system. Basically deprive them of the right to establish any checks and balances on the powers of the executive. The executive can pass any legislation it wishes in the Knesset, and whereas until now and still today, the Supreme Court can rule certain legislation and certain acts of the executive as unconstitutional, so to speak. We don't have a constitution, but we have some basic laws. That is going to be stripped away. And with that, the executive will control the legislature as it does, as well as the Supreme Court.
So
that's not a democracy.
Okay. So in Israel, the presidency is largely a ceremonial position, but President Isaac Herzog has jumped into this situation with both feet. He gave a very dramatic speech where he described the situation as bordering on a potential civil war and violence. He urged both sides here to find a way to compromise and negotiate. That didn't happen. The opposition asked for the legislation to be frozen while the negotiation took place. The government said, no, we'll negotiate, but we have to continue. So there was no movement toward a negotiation. And then President Herzog put forward his own framing proposal that would be the basis of a negotiation. As I understand it, the opposition accepted President Herzog's proposal. The government rather quickly rejected it. So where does President Herzog go from here, if anywhere? Is his job at this point done, or does he still have a play in this situation?
He does have a play in the situation. As you said, his role is primarily symbolic, but nonetheless, he represents a certain national consensus, or is supposed to. And he has a few cards up his sleeves that he can play. He can continue negotiating with the two sides to see if something along the lines of what he has suggested can be acceptable. And he can go as dramatic as some have suggested, as what the situation calls for. We are in an unprecedented situation. The last 2.5 months have seen an assault on our democratic principles and on the values of our Declaration of Independence that are unprecedented. Some say that the president has to react to it in unprecedented ways, like resigning. It's not that I expect him to do so anytime soon, but with your permission, I'd like to set the setting and explain why are we where we are in this assault on our democratic values and institutions. The coalition that was formed by Prime Minister Netanyahu, which is his sixth, was unlike any before. He assembled the most extreme elements in Israeli society, only ones willing and able to provide him with the one thing that he's been striving for the last 5 years. We were dragged into 5 cycles of elections only in order to get to this moment when there is a majority in the Knesset that will provide him with annulment of his legal cases. He's been indicted and he's now under trial for corruption, breach of trust, and what's the term for shohad? Bribery.
Bribery.
Yep. Since the indictment and certainly the trial, it's not the same Netanyahu that we had known previously. I mean, I've known him since the mid 1980s when we appointed him as to Washington and later on to the UN, and I was, so to speak, his boss from the Prime Minister's office. He's been a patriot. I didn't see eye to eye with him on many issues, but he was certainly a patriot who wanted the best for the country. Since the indictment, he has only one ambition, and that is how to make it go away. And he's been willing to go to lengths that we had not anticipated, and Israeli democratic system had not anticipated, and therefore did not build the immune system against these kind of efforts. Now he has these, lunatics, Ben-Gvir, Smotrich, and some others in his coalition, only because each of them, for their own different agenda, messianic agenda, need the same thing, to do away with the Supreme Court. The annexationists want the Supreme Court not to intervene with annexation. The Jewish supremacists wanted not to intervene with undermining the rights of Israeli citizens of Arab descent. The homophobes want homosexuals and lesbians back in the closet. And so you go one by one. There are 5 or 6 different segments, each with a completely different agenda, all converging on undoing the Supreme Court. President Herzog suggested something that preserves the supremacy of the courts, and therefore there's no way in the world that this coalition can accept it.
Well, let's unpack the protest movement a little bit. You know, we see the incredible pictures of hundreds of thousands of people week after week taking to the streets. We've seen other kinds of protests where people are stopping traffic and major highways in Israel. Tell us a little bit more about the protest movement. Who's in the protest movement? We've heard it's a cross-section of Israeli society. What does that mean? Does the protest movement have a kind of an overarching strategy that it's deploying here, or is this kind of just going on an ad hoc basis? Is it gaining energy? Is it losing energy? And I'm throwing a lot of questions at once, but kind of try to fold it all in. What happens if the government's overhaul of the judiciary actually passes, and it basically in the form that it's presented? What happens then? Civil disobedience? And what happens if the Supreme Court decides that the overhaul package is not acceptable and rules to annul it? You know, who does the IDF listen to? Who do the police listen to? Do they listen to the government that just passed these laws, or do they listen to the Supreme Court that says that these laws are not valid? Are we heading toward a potential constitutional crisis? And I got to say, I was listening to a podcast earlier this morning. Rabbi Daniel Hartman from the Hartman Institute was speaking to a Federation assembly, and he said, from his point of view, the protesters have won. The government is going to give in. There may be a reform, but not the reform that the government wishes. Are you as optimistic as he is?
I'm less versed with what will happen than with what has happened. And the reason is that we are in an unprecedented situation. We've never had this kind of thing. We had national protests. We had disagreements on policy, some of them very sharp, like the opposition to withdrawal from Gaza 17 years ago, like the protest against the war in Lebanon earlier. We've had protests in this country. We've never had a situation where more than half of the people, by all public opinion polls, believe that this is an assault. No, it's not a policy difference. It's an assault on our democracy. It's an attempt to change the system. The protest is all grassroots. There is no leadership to the protest. Some say it's a problem. Some say it's a great advantage. It is spontaneous. What emerged over the 10 weeks or now 11 weeks of the protest was a coordinating committee, not leadership, just some group that brings everybody or representatives of about 100 different entities into the same room in order to make sure that they don't step on each other's toes or whatever. So it's coordination rather than leadership. The root of it, the trigger is the assault on the democratic system. The root of it is far deeper and was not born with this government. There's a major concern among Israelis who serve in the army, pay taxes and work, and carry the burden of the Israeli society, including on behalf of those who do not serve in the military, who do not work, and who this government has promised that they will be as compensated financially for not doing their duty as those who are. So the resentment was there for a long time, but it broke with the package of legislation that including huge funds for those who spend their days in religious schools, which prohibit the teachings of anything secular, from English to science to anything that is relevant to the 21st century citizen, and therefore guarantees that a substantial segment of Israeli society is going to continue to be a burden on those who are paying taxes and serving in the military and other security services. You will find in the streets just about everybody. In the beginning, it was more homogeneous. Now it is completely heterogeneous. And you find former Likud voters, certainly people from the center, certainly people from the left, whatever is left of the center in Israel. But perhaps the two clusters of protesters that attract most attention, and rightfully so, are the reservists, military reservists, and the high-tech sector. In Israel, the reserve duty is the backbone of the Israeli army. The standing army is very small. Whenever there is an emergency, it is the reserve that take over. In some units of the military, in some forces, even the standing army depends primarily, not just partially, primarily on reserve officers, such as the Air Force. In any Air Force base in Israel, something like 60% of the pilots are on reserve duty. They can go and fly with El Al or Arkia or whatever, or be businessmen, whatever. But one day a week they come to the base for training every week, and on mission they are there. Those who are allegedly striking in Syria are Israeli reservists. When they came out, one after the other, one group after the other, 100 pilots, 120 from the cyber unit, and so on and so on. And I'm proud to say 250 retired generals, heads of Mossad, Shin Bet, National Security Council. 250 signed the full-page ad in Friday's Haaretz, in which they accused the Prime Minister and his government of undermining national security and spell out the concern, the specific damage to national security stemming from what's going on.
Nimrod,
So-
let me just, Nimrod, the ad is in the chat, and I'm watching the clock, and I want to be respectful of the time that Congresswoman Wild and Steve have. I had two more questions. One I'm going to hold till toward the end, which is what we're doing about this here in America and how you use what we're doing here in America from an Israeli perspective. Let's put that on hold. One last, and if you could just in a couple of minutes, you know, this revolves around Israel's democracy. The Israeli flags are waving. And there even seems to be an intention to separate out the Palestinian issue from, you know, these protests, but there is an intersection. So in just a couple of minutes, if you could explain how the Palestinian issue and what's going on in the West Bank intersects with the protests against the government's plan. But quickly, so we can move on to the next phase.
In real life, things are happening on the West Bank, and in a week or two will happen in Jerusalem, I'm afraid, when the holidays of Ramadan and Pesach, Passover converge. This is an explosive moment always, every year. There were developments on the West Bank and in Gaza that have nothing to do with the current government. They've been going on for a long time. But this government has not only accelerated them, but is bringing them to their point of explosive logical conclusion. It's the weakening of the Palestinian Authority, the more inclination of Palestinian youth to express their frustration with the Palestinian Authority and with Israel by violence, and last but certainly not least, an emboldened settler movement that becomes more and more violent vis-a-vis Palestinians, and therefore the extremists on both sides are feeding on each other. This is in real life. As far as the demonstrations, there were serious discussion. Should we bring it in or not? And for tactical reasons, there was a decision to keep it out in order to allow people who don't share our support for a two-state solution to come and demonstrate for Israel's democracy.
Okay. Let me at this point give the virtual baton over to my friend Steve Sheffy and Congresswoman Wild to take it from here.
Thank you very much, Martin. It's a tremendous pleasure to be here with you and with Jill. And I would agree with what Jill said, certainly about the wonderful work that Haley Soifer does for the Jewish Democratic Council of America and for Jewish Democratic Council of America. But I would add, Jill, that you praised everyone about yourself in your introductions. And I've seen a lot of state Democratic organizations, and everyone on this call should know that Democratic Jewish Outreach of Pennsylvania is a model for the entire country in terms of what a Jewish state-oriented Democratic organization can do. You just look at the results, Shapiro, Fetterman. So hats off to all of you, to you, Martin, and to you, Jill, for leading such an incredibly strong organization.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. You deserve it. And one example, not that she's not a great example on her own, is Representative Wild, who is an amazing member of Congress. She's bright, she's open-minded, she cares, she's genuine. Whatever your stereotype of a politician is, she's not it. I mean, she's in for all the right reasons, and she's just amazing. And Representative Wild, welcome. And my understanding is that you recently returned from a trip to Israel, a congressional delegation. Could you share with us what you learned on that trip, and also what you may have seen on your trip that those of us in America need to know?
Well, hello, everybody. Good morning. Thank you, Steve. I concur in everything you just said about DJOP and Jill, for sure. I would need hours to share with all of you the many things that I learned during this recent trip. Let me start by saying it was my 5th time to Israel, so it wasn't as though I was a newbie. And in fact, it was designed to be what was referred to as the AP trip, as opposed to the Israel 101 trip. So everybody on the trip other than perhaps one or two people, had spent a decent amount of time in Israel before. I should also preface it by saying that I have been an AIPAC endorsed candidate since the time that they started endorsing, which was just last cycle, and that J Street does not necessarily fit the profile of many of the Jews in my district. Having said that, we don't have a particularly large Jewish population, but I did receive some severe pushback on going on this trip to begin with, and later on the trip found out that all of my colleagues did as well. And when I say pushback, I mean from AIPAC. And I will tell you that several of us on the trip who consider ourselves to be very pro-Israel were on guard the entire time for signs of either an anti-Israel bent or just something that was further left than we were comfortable with. And I will tell you that although there were a couple of events or speakers, I shouldn't say events, that were decidedly anti-Israel, I would say, or anti-Israel government, I would say. The rest of the trip was incredibly fair, I thought. It taught me, and I learned a lot of things that I have never learned in my other trips to Israel. As I said, I could go on all day, but we spent some time at the Shimon Peres Peace Center, which was very impactful. Had never been there before, which I was surprised by. But in addition to that, we went to the Knesset. We met with the opposition leader, Lapid. We met with the labor leader, whose name I think is Michaeli, the woman. And that was very interesting in answer to somebody's question about what the overhaul of the judicial system would mean. They both seemed joined in believing that it would be a disaster for Israel if what is proposed now carries forward. But probably the most meaningful parts of the trip were things that you don't normally do on a trip to Israel, at least not one that is sanctioned by the Israeli government or in many cases the US government. We went to two settlements, the most impactful of which was Hebron. Had never been there. I'm sure some of you have been. It was a devastating experience, and I can elaborate on that if you want me to. We went to another settlement whose name I can't recall, but our leader on that particular segment of the trip was a woman from Ohio, Ruthie, who has lived on the other side of the Green Line for 38 years now and made Aliyah with her entire family a number of years ago. We went to a small Palestinian village, Susi, after Hebron. And I probably didn't say that correctly, but we broke bread with the Palestinian village. The most impactful moment of the entire trip for me was hearing from the Palestinian gentleman who was, I guess, the leader of that particular village. When we first got there, the first thing we saw was a big playground that had a fence around it, but it also had very modern playground equipment, including the padding that you see on modern playgrounds here, for the safety of the children and that kind of thing. But this playground was padlocked. And what we learned was that he had taken it upon himself to create this lovely playground for the children of the village, and had applied for a permit as is required from the Israeli government. What we were told was that such permits are never granted. And so he went ahead with the building of this playground, and it was promptly padlocked. The appropriate Israeli officials came in, shut it down, padlocked it, and it's not accessible to the children of the village. And he showed us this very small, not even small playground. He showed us what was the playground they had prior, which was two broken concrete slabs with ancient dangerous playground equipment that you would never let your children play on, metal seesaws, things like that. And the children were actually playing on this old playground because they didn't have access to the new one. And that was probably the most disturbing part of the entire trip for me. We also met with Bibi. He refused to meet with any of the J Street officials. So there were a dozen of us who were members of Congress, maybe a few more than a dozen. And we sat down with Bibi in a conference room, just us with him. Met with him for about 90 minutes. He did cancel our visit twice, but we ultimately were able to have it. It was, and also along the way, when we went to Hebron and the other settlement, we were accompanied by former IDF soldiers who are part of the organization known as Breaking the Silence, which, if you don't know of it, I strongly recommend that you look at it. And they were former soldiers who actually had committed some of what they consider to be the atrocities of what the IDF does to Palestinian villages when settlements are in place. And they described it. They described what they had done in there, and this was clearly before they had become part of this organization, Breaking the Silence. And I have to say, we only met with a few of these former soldiers, but it is a fairly large organization. So that's just kind of an overview of what we did. Obviously, we had some very nice meals and that kind of thing. We did see the protests. We had the benefit of being in Israel just as all of this new stuff was starting. The protests were the protests had been underway, I guess, for a few days or a week. We saw them. I don't think they were as large as they are right now, but they were pretty big. It was just, we went to East Jerusalem, spent some time in East Jerusalem, which, as I'm sure most of you know, is primarily Palestinians who live there. And I just can't, I could answer any kind of specific questions on these many visits, but overall, it was a deeply impactful trip and showed me things that I had never seen before, despite my tremendous commitment to Israel.
That's what you've just described is a good example, not only of what a member of Congress should be doing, getting all the facts, but also, as Edmund Burke famously said, the role of a representative is not simply to do a poll and reflect whatever their district may or may not think, but to do the right thing and to lead. And by going on this trip in the face of pressure from some of your constituents and perhaps others, you did that. And that's a reason why everyone in this call and everyone who knows about this should be supporting members of Congress like you, because you did the right thing and you deserve our support. One of the things, and that leads to my next question, which is that given what Nimrod said, given what you have said, it's, Israel was once and should be a bipartisan issue. And yet it seems that only Democrats are speaking out in different ways and to varying degrees, but only Democrats are speaking out against what's going on in Israel. And they're doing so from a position of love for Israel. They're concerned about the US-Israel relationship. They're concerned about protecting democracy. They're concerned about Israel's safety and security. But why are only Democrats speaking out? And do you think that this is becoming a partisan issue because of the failure of Republicans to speak out in support of the Israelis like Nimrod, who are doing what is right?
In part, but I'm not going to blame the Republicans entirely. I do think that many Republicans have different motivations for being pro-Israel than many of us Democrats do. I don't know that their motivation is necessarily stems from the fact that Israel is hopefully and will continue to be a democracy, as much as it has to do with evangelical reasons and also in general being more hawkish than many Democrats are. I put the partisanship issue and the fact that only Democrats, when I'm talking about elected officials, ever dare to speak out about and I'm not going to say against Israel, because that's not what I am doing. I just feel as though it is incredibly important, just as it is in this country, that we know we have a full picture of what the government is doing, being able to challenge it when we think it's appropriate, as we do here, as I have done with the Biden administration on several occasions and past administrations. I think and quite honestly, I place a lot of the blame on a very influential pro-Israel lobby that does not encourage the light to be shown on what's happening there.
Thank you. Going back to what you said about Hebron, a two-part question. Number one, I think we would be interested in hearing at least a summary of what you saw there with your own eyes. But also the question then is, why, given what you saw, why should Americans care about the occupation? I mean, why is it, for example, some people say that Israel is a democracy, or at least it is right now. Israel elects a government. If Israel chooses to continue the occupation, if Israel chooses to expand settlements, if Israel chooses to have creeping annexation, why isn't it up to them? What business is it of the United States and of Congress and of the president to tell Israelis what they should or should not be doing in places like Hebron?
So I'm going to answer the second part of that question first, and then make sure I answer the part about Hebron. Let me just say that you can't have it both ways. We are expected to unconditionally support Israel with a vast amount of money, and almost all of us do so in Congress, vote for it. Obviously, we have all voted for Iron Dome funding and far beyond that, in a way that, quite frankly, we don't do with other countries that we provide aid to. And by that, I mean the unconditional aspect of it. We don't normally provide aid unconditionally to other countries. So from a strictly pragmatic governmental point of view, I think that entitles the United States government to have some say in what is happening in Israel. And I will leave it to others to talk about the right of all Jews to return to Israel and to make it a livable, functional democracy and so forth. But strictly on a very pragmatic level, we provide a huge amount of aid. And I think that gives us standing, I say, as a lawyer, or grounds for questioning things. The other piece of it is that for those of us, and I think it's probably everybody on this call, who want to see Israel continue to exist, who want it to be the place that all Jews can go if they choose to, can return to. It's in our best interest to keep Israel as a democracy. And what we are seeing right now is an absolute deviation from democracy, in my opinion. I will tell you that we talked to people, we talked to some people in Tel Aviv, and as most of you know, folks in Tel Aviv generally are much less observing of Judaism than people in Jerusalem. And so many of them, just love Tel Aviv, enjoy living there, don't keep kosher. The restaurants, I was surprised when we went the first night we went to a restaurant that wasn't kosher, because I just assumed that it would be. But I will tell you, we were told by a member of a family of about 50 people in this family who have lived in Tel Aviv for decades, and they are preparing to possibly leave as a family from Israel because they don't know that they can continue to live there if it's going to be a right-wing extremist kind of government. So there's that aspect of it that I think is in all of our interests, particularly American Jews, to make sure that Israel does remain a democracy and a place where people want to live. And finally, I have to say something this was the most startling thing for me on the trip. When we went to the second settlement, one whose name I can't recall, but it was led by this woman, Ruthie from Ohio, who's lived there for all these years with her entire family. At some point, she made mention of voting. And something about the way, and I don't remember what the context was, but it caused me to ask her when it was my turn to ask questions. I said, you can vote in Israel. Yeah. First I said, you have dual citizenship with the US. Yes. Dual Israeli US citizenship. Anyway, without going through the whole long story, she votes in Israel and she votes in the United States. She has no intention of ever returning to the United States, except possibly to visit. And so in these times, I was frankly shocked that somebody who has lived there for 38 years with no intention of returning can vote in US elections. And that is true of many, many, many people in Israel. I personally have a problem with it. And as you all know, we are under great attack from the GOP about voting rights and allegedly letting illegal immigrants vote in the United States and that kind of thing. And yet we have an entire population of dual citizens who are voting in our elections. And I have a problem with that. I asked Ruthie whether she was extolling the fact that she goes to a market where Palestinians are allowed to shop and they work in the shop and that kind of thing. And I said, so are your Palestinian shop, employees, are they allowed to vote in Israeli elections? Of course, you probably all know the answer to that. The answer is no, of course they aren't. They can only vote in the West Bank. So anyway, if we are going to allow a sizable segment, and I don't have numbers yet, although I am looking into it along with Colin Allred from Texas, because he's a former voting rights attorney, and he and I were just absolutely shocked by that aspect of the presentation. But many thousands of people to vote in US elections because of this dual citizenship, then I think we absolutely have standing and the right to weigh in on what happens in Israel. Without going on too long, I just want to address Hebron. That was, we were accompanied by two of the former IDF soldiers who were part of Breaking the Silence. We were also greeted, unlike every other trip I have taken, we did not have IDF soldiers with us, current IDF soldiers with us throughout the trip. Certainly when I went with AIPAC, we did. When I've been on family missions through my local JCC and Federation, we always had IDF soldiers with us. We did not on this J Street trip. But when we got to Hebron, we were greeted by a pack of current IDF soldiers who followed us everywhere we went. One of the leaders that was speaking, who was one of these former IDF soldiers, was being very outspoken about what he felt about Hebron, which led to one of the IDF soldiers running off, getting a commander who came in and essentially told us, our time in Hebron was up. But what we saw while we were there, was a concentration of a settlement in the middle of a small city, and the Palestinian area is all on the outskirts of Hebron. And there were a large number, blocks of what used to be Palestinian shops that had been closed down, padlocked, welded shut. And depending on who you believe, the Israeli government would tell you that the Palestinians who were evicted from their shops have been compensated. Others would tell you they absolutely have not been compensated, and I don't know which is true. But what really struck me was that there are some Palestinians, and I don't know why exactly, who are still permitted to live above what used to be their shops, but they are not allowed to come out into the street. Their apartments, which we could see, literally have cages around the windows. Small children were out on these cages, looking down at us, waving, doing that kind of thing. And my understanding is that there's some exit from their apartments where they can get to the Palestinian part of Hebron. We obviously did not get to see that, but these children are essentially looking down on a place that their parents used to work and shop and own their businesses, but they're not permitted to come down. And it unfortunately, it reminded me an awful lot of what was happening under the Trump administration with children at the southern border, which we were all incredibly critical of. I mean, these children were not separated from their families, but they were clearly not free to go. And the last thing about it was, as we were leaving, oh, and by the way, while we were there, women, Israeli women from the settlement were chasing us with iPhone cameras, speaking in Hebrew, clearly very unhappy with us, but videoing us the whole time that we were there. We were warned that that would happen. But as we were leaving, somebody pointed out to me that there were these cages that I just described were caged on top, on the sides, and in the front. So it's not like you could climb over them or anything. On top of these cages were rocks. And I was told that those rocks were the result of settlers' children who threw rocks up at these children in the cages. And it's called, Hebron is called a ghost town by a number of people, like in who are not part of the settlement. And it is a virtual ghost town, except at least when we were there, it was a virtual ghost town, except for these children that we saw. So,
Congresswoman, that's very sad and depressing, but I think it also speaks very well of the trip you went down, which gave you both sides. And I think I have just one last question before we turn it over to a discussion that will bring back Nimrod and Martin and Jill.
Steve, just real quick, people should know that we're going to go till 12:15. So don't run away at noon. We're going to extend this for 15 minutes, which I think is necessary.
Thanks, Martin.
just,
Susan,
okay, just so you know, I'm supposed to be at a 12:30 lunch, so I need to message this person, but I'd like to do that. So
great. So Susan, I think that you have done a very good job of modeling for us how it is possible to be a very pro-Israel member of Congress and at the same time voice reasonable criticisms of what's going on in Israel, not from a position of disliking Israel, but from a love for Israel and for really wanting a strong U.S.-Israel relationship. This is exactly how it should be done. And you've given a master class in that. And my last question pertains to this. You may have seen that Gallup released a poll very recently, last week, that purports to show that for the first time, Democrats sympathize more, not Jewish Democrats, Democrats generally sympathize more with Palestinians than with Israelis. And a point that many of us have made in the Democratic Jewish community is that sympathy is not a synonym for support. And the poll was binary. It's possible to sympathize with Palestinian kids in cages that you saw. It's possible to sympathize with Palestinians who cannot vote. More than one sympathizes with a powerful country like Israel, but at the same time support Israel. Naturally, as you might expect, some of our Republican friends are seizing on this poll to say, oh, here we go again. Democrats don't support Israel. You got to support Republicans if you like Israel. How do you respond, or how should we respond when our Republican friends, and some of us do have Republican friends, when our Republican friends come to us and say, look at this poll, if you claim to support Israel, how could you possibly support the Democratic Party in the light of these polling results?
well, when I was, meeting with Bibi, I actually said to him somewhat in jest that Israel needed a new PR firm, because after he had extolled the many virtues and criticisms of what the Palestinians were doing and that kind of thing, I said, if that's true, then you really need a new PR firm. He didn't find that very amusing. But I did point out to him that, first of all, Congress, upon whom the Israeli government relies tremendously for support and funding, is getting younger. And by definition, almost, that means that it's going to get a little more liberal. That's not always the case. Obviously, we all know some young Republicans, and there are plenty on the other side of the aisle from me and that kind of thing. But I will tell you that what I said to him was, I'm worried that in a decade, let's say, it's not going to be this year or next year, in a decade, maybe a little longer, Israel may find itself not enjoying the broad spread support that it currently does from the US Congress. And I think that is a very real threat to Israel. And I don't know why that is not a greater concern of him particularly. And you know, I think that in terms, I will say this, I think the vast majority of America, I'm not sure how much faith I put into that poll. I think the vast majority of Americans know far less about Israel than they probably should, considering the amount of our tax dollars that go there, and the importance of Israel generally to democracy and security around the world. So I'm not sure how much faith I put in that poll, and how, I don't know how well informed it is. But I do think that there is an existential concern for Israel, that people who really do know Israel in the US and the Israelis should be very, very concerned about. And the last thing I'll say is, I don't believe, and this is probably not very profound, I don't believe that Bibi wants a two-state solution. And I don't believe that most people in the right wing of either Israel or the United States want a two-state solution. And quite honestly, taking people's homes away, invading the space where they live, is a really good way to make sure that you are not ever going to have peace in Israel. So I say all of that, understanding full well the dangers to Israel from Iran, from Gaza at times. I fully support the Iron Dome. But I just don't see a path to continuing a democracy or hope for a two-state solution if the current government continues to control things.
And let's
Thank you
turn
so-
it back over now to Martin. I'd like to hear Nimrod's thoughts on some of this. as
Yeah,
well.
and Nimrod, as you maybe react to what you've heard from Congresswoman Wild, also let me ask you this. You know, the Congress obviously is autonomous. It can decide to do what it wants to do. The Democrats, you know, caucus, they can decide. The administration, certainly, the Jewish community, Jewish Democrats, we all, you know, can make decisions for ourselves about how we respond both to the judicial overhaul issue and to the Palestinian issue. But from the vantage point in Israel, what are your thoughts about how our actions here are perceived? I mean, we want to be constructive, we want to be impactful, we don't want to have our whatever actions we take here be counterproductive and undermine the efforts to support Israel's democracy and the two-state solution. So strictly from a personal vantage point from your end in Israel, what are good things to do and what are things that might be counterproductive on our end over here?
Well, I'll be less presumptuous than I should be as an Israeli. We usually are in telling you what to do, but nonetheless, I have some thoughts. First, I want to say that my admiration to Congressman Wild for taking the trip, for what it stands for, what she stands for, and for speaking out on these issues. I mean, nothing is more important by leaders. Look, I've been a student of U.S.-Israel relations forever. And I always knew the basic truth. These relationships rest on two legs. One is shared values, and the other one is common interests. What we see today is undermining both. If Israel ends up in 2 weeks, 3 weeks, with Rush legislation becoming non-democratic, we are undercutting one leg, and our policy in the Palestinian territories is cutting the other. We have a prime minister who undermined bipartisanship way before his troubles, investing in the evangelicals and the Republicans and making it a one-party support system. And his former ambassador was outspoken about it, saying that evangelicals are more important than the Jewish community. Sheer nonsense. I share the concerns of Congressman Wild that the next generation of the American Jewish community and of those in Congress, Jewish and otherwise, are going to be a lot less connected to the kind of Israel that might emerge should the protest fail. One thing about Israelis is that they very much value the American component of the Israeli strategic equation. It is not just the huge amount of assistance that we get and the weapon systems that we can get nowhere else. It is also the cover that we get in the United Nations and other multilateral organizations when they go anti-Israel, and the US is the only one that stands up and vetoes declarations that might be damaging to our security. The relations are multifaceted. It's a main component of Israel's strategic equation. Our deterrence is based also, obviously, on the strength of the IDF, on the strength of our Shin Bet and Mossad and so on. But the American component is indispensable. And undermining it is totally irresponsible, reckless for our leadership. And when the US speaks out, Israelis do hear it. There is no one factor that will turn the tables on the assault on our democracy, but the cumulative effect is what counts. So we do our job in demonstrating here, and we are eager to hear your voices as a Jewish community and encouraging the administration and Congress to speak out, because the time to talk back is long overdue.
Jill, I suspect there may be some questions.
Yes, there are. So I'm going to go through a couple of the questions. Someone asked, given all the strife that is occurring in Israel with the protests and so on, what are the chances of the current coalition collapsing? And if it did collapse, who would take over? Would it be someone more even to the right of Bibi, or would there be a chance for a more moderate government to take hold?
I think that's for Nimrod.
That's for Nimrod, yes.
Look, I don't see this, well, I reiterate one thing I said before. We are in uncharted territory. We've never been there before. Will the dynamics bring about the disintegration of the coalition? I doubt that very much. Will it lead to some kind of a plea deal between the prime minister and the prosecution, where he leaves office and either new elections are called, or in our system, a new coalition can be formed within the current Knesset? That is a possibility. If that happens, it's not going to be anything like the current coalition. There is nothing to the right of the current coalition. You fall off the globe if you go to their right. There's no room there. So if this coalition, if Netanyahu alone leaves politics and someone else from Likud takes over, there will be reshuffling of Israeli politics. We're going to see a center-right coalition that does not pursue such reckless policies domestically and externally.
And Susan, I have a question for you. If the worst happens in Israel, where they push through this decimation of their Supreme Court, what practically does that mean in terms of what the Biden administration would do, what Congress would do? I guess, if Israel becomes a non-democratic Israel, what does that mean politically?
It's a very good question, Jill. I believe the Biden administration has either signaled or actually said that they will not condition aid to Israel on what happens with the judicial system there. I think that's the current Biden administration position on it. As far as what Congress would do, it's hard to say. I think right now it wouldn't, with a Republican majority, I don't think there's any issue about the support continuing. And I think that the majority of the Democratic caucus would also vote for unconditional support, at least for the foreseeable future. There would be some defectors for sure. I would not be among the defectors. I would continue to vote for support for Israel. But I will tell you that that's why I said I think that the risk going forward over the next decade, because of course we have new elections every 2 years in Congress, and we have repeatedly seen younger and younger members of Congress, and that's a great thing, by the way. I don't criticize that. But their views tend to be much less solidified about being pro-Israel. And so I think the long term is not good, but in the short term, I don't think it would really change anything in terms of that support. And I'm only limiting it to this question you asked about the judicial system.
Also, what does it mean for the American Jewish community? This is for all four of you. We have 30 representatives of Jewish federations that went to Israel. There have been large Jewish organizations who for the first time have really been more vocal in their distress about what's happening in Israel. American Jewish support of Israel is not that it's just a Jewish homeland. It's that we have shared values. We have shared democratic values. Does this forever divide? If we were to lose democracy in Israel, does this separate the diaspora community from the nation of Israel?
Well, let me say, you mentioned the delegation from the Jewish Federations of North America. It's the first time I recall that the collective body of the Jewish federations weighed in heavily on anything other than religious pluralism in Israel. That's an issue that goes back decades, where federations have been involved. But this goes to something much deeper than that. And I've been very surprised that they've been very explicit in their criticism of the Israeli government, something that hasn't happened before. I would also just flag, and it comes back to federations, we're approaching Israel's 75th anniversary, and federations around the country are planning activities in conjunction with the celebration of that anniversary. And I know some federations are beginning to grapple with the question, how do they factor in, the turmoil that's going on in Israel around all of these issues into that celebration? And it's not easy, but that's something I think the American Jewish community is going to have to grapple with.
What are your thoughts, Steve?
I think Martin is right. I would add, though, that, and Susan, Representative Wild was careful to point out that her comments pertain to the judicial overhaul. The federations remain silent on the West Bank. I mean, that's a big issue, too. And I think, one of the reasons many of us support Commanders for Israel's security to the extent we can over here and admire Nimrod Novik so much is that, the failure to attain a two-state solution by Israel is also a threat to Israel's democracy. And while the judicial overhaul is a clear and present danger, because with one vote, the Knesset can take action that would cause irreparable damage, the continuing lack of progress toward a two-state solution, continued settlement expansion, continued creeping annexation. This government's made very clear it's not interested in a two-state solution. That's also a threat to Israel's democracy. That's also a threat to our shared values. And federations, it's great that they went to speak out about this privately, of course, as is their custom, but it's not, if they're not speaking out about the occupation, that's a problem as well. And those of us who care about Israel's future as a Jewish democratic state need to do that, because if there's a temporary military occupation, then yes, you can say, well, it's temporary. Of course, the people there don't get to vote. No country would give people in a temporary military occupation the right to vote. But the more it looks permanent, the more it looks as if it's never going away, the less and less Israel looks like a democracy. And eventually it's going to be almost impossible to argue that. Now, it's not a question of who's right and who's wrong. Jews don't have to give up their narrative. They don't have to, Jews do have historic and legal and moral connections to all of the West Bank. There's no question about that. And there are Palestinians who have connections to Tel Aviv, to Haifa, who used to live there and now don't. And neither side has to give up its narrative. Neither side has to say that they don't have to give up anything they believe, but both sides have to be able to say, you know what? We want to live in peace and security. That means we're going to have to give up some of the land we think is ours. And that's not happening on Israel's side or on the Palestinian side. And until it does, and unless the United States does more to make that possible, we have a severe risk to Israel's security and to Israel's future as a democracy.
I think, Steve, we're all two-staters here. And Nimrod, I know, works very hard from his side in Israel to try to promote the conditions that eventually could lead to a negotiated agreement between Israel and the Palestinians. It's obviously not going to happen today or tomorrow, but preserving the conditions that will allow it to be negotiated sometime when the political stars are aligned is really the critical agenda right now.
I agree. I think also from the US perspective and the political perspective, Republicans and Democrats used to be on the same page with respect to Israel. It's now become a political weapon by the left. And
by the far right, let me tell you.
Excuse me, I meant the far right.
Because if we can have these discussions, then we are labeled anti-Semites.
Right, I meant the right. Thank you for correcting me. But by the GOP and the far right. And what can we do to return this to a bipartisan conversation? We see that the GOP uses it as a bludgeon to win electoral politics, when it really should be both the GOP and the Democrats working to figure out peace in the region. And I don't know that there's necessarily.
I'd like to ask Susan, do you have Republican colleagues in the House who, think along these lines? It's important to continue to promote the two-state vision, but they're afraid to come out and be vocal about it. Are there pockets of support for two states among your Republican colleagues?
Not that I'm aware of, Martin. I mean, they may pay lip service to two-state solution. They may even really believe it, but they would certainly draw the line. And I even the ones that I know quite well on the Foreign Affairs Committee, I don't know of any who would be overtly critical.
Got it.
And many Democrats, moderate Democrats in particular, are similarly very disinclined, but perhaps for different reasons, to be at all critical.
Right. The concern is that there's the inability to distinguish between criticism of the government of Israel and support of Israel as a nation. And unfortunately, the GOP seems to use it for political ads as opposed to trying to establish real peace in the region.
Nimrod had his finger up.
Yes, so go ahead. And then I have another question.
May I?
Yes, go ahead.
Look, I will not presume to say anything about what should happen in Congress, but I would say that to restore bipartisanship is not just an American thing, it's also an Israeli thing. The previous government of Bennett and Lapid went a long way in restoring the bipartisan approach from the Israeli perspective. But here we go again, and we have another coalition, just like the previous ones of Netanyahu, that betrays that cause. I'd like to say something about the first question you raised, and you said to the four of us, and that's the Jewish community, what should be done. I'd like to say the following. Obviously, decisions are going to be made by those who live here and will face the consequences. However, I think that the era of a monologue, we Israelis have the right to ask American Jewish community to support us. And the American Jewish community does not have the right to talk back and say, look, you'll make your decision. But when you do, here is what we think is required for us to be able to deliver for you. You cannot pursue policies that undercut our ability to approach our leadership on your behalf. So factor in the sentiment, the analysis, the thoughts of the American Jewish community. We need to have a healthy dialogue, not a monologue. And yes, there are plenty of Israelis who hold the position that anybody who doesn't live here doesn't have the right to tell us what to do. I and my colleagues in Commanders and my colleagues elsewhere resent that and believe that if indeed Israel is a joint venture of Israelis and Jewish communities the world over, then we better behave as such and be modest and listen and factor the sentiment and analysis and thoughts of the American part of the Mishpucha.
Well said, Nimrod. Susan, I'm going to end the last question with you. There's a lot of, people on this call who are aligned with your views. What do you believe we can do as the American Jewish community that would be most helpful right now? What is our action item?
Well, this is sort of a continuation of what Nimrod and others have said, and that is, and Martin and Steve, we've got to increase the dialogue, and we've got to be more open about our view. We have to understand that people can be pro-Israel, vehemently pro-Israel, and still be critical of what is happening now or at any given time, because that is, the nature of a democracy. I think that to the extent that we can go back to our respective federations or whatever Jewish groups we are involved with and encourage this kind of bilateral, I'll say, conversation, I think it would make a lot of sense. I will tell you that I do get the feeling that Bibi and those he's closely associated with right now feel as though there is will always be unequivocal support from the United States. And I'm not opposed to unequivocal support of the United States going forward, but what it does is that I think it emboldens them to not worry about anything that we might think, because they're really not hearing these viewpoints from American Jews like yourselves.
Thank you, Susan.
And I'm sorry, I'm really sorry.
We're concluding now. So I just thank you, Susan, so much for being
Thank you,
here.
everybody.
I know you're very busy. We wish you the best of luck. And just so everyone knows, Susan Wild is the DJOP endorsed candidate. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Nimrod Novick. Thank you, of course, Martin. Thank all of you for being here today. And please join us for our next event on April 18th about anti-Semitism in America and how to combat it. Thank you, and have a good, at this point, afternoon.